So welcome everybody to today's discussion on securing your cloud-native architecture. I'm Michelle McLean and I run marketing here at StackRox, and I've had the great pleasure of working with several of these folks for a while now. And I just want to welcome them and thank them for their time today. So George, CISO at Sumo, you and I have had the opportunity to have some fun conversations. Thank you so much for joining the discussion today. Glad you're here.
My pleasure, Michelle. It's always great to work with StackRox and AWS.
Awesome. And joining George from Sumo today is Frank Reno. Frank, thank you so much for making yourself available.
Thanks for having me. Looking forward to the conversation today, and great to be here.
Fantastic. And Jonah, we've been working together a little more recently here. Thank you so much for sharing some information about Amazon and AWS, particularly Amazon EKS. So thank you so much for making yourself available for the audience today as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really excited for the talk today.
Cool. All right, so you have a lot of speakers coming at you today. I'm going to talk the least. You will learn a lot more from everybody else. But we're going to kick things off with the crew from Sumo, talking a little bit about their cloud journey. We're going to hear from Jonah about some of the design principles in Amazon EKS. And then I'm going to round it out by just talking a little bit about bridging DevOps and security and, leveraging some of the industry best practices in your own deployments. And so with that, George, I'm going to hand things off to you and take it away. Thank you so much for sharing the Sumo story.
Awesome. Yeah, no worries. So I think, this is a very important and timely subject because as people are migrating to container stacks, as people are thinking about migrating to container stacks, it's so important to start considering security early and upfront. So we all know the advantages of, mobilizing your workloads and building things out in microservices and the agility that it gives us. But at the same time, there's also proposed new risks that always come with any kind of new technology out there. And what I find in talking to a lot of my peers who I have a lot of respect for is that they sometimes wait a little bit too long to start looking at these things or implementing different security solutions or baking security solutions in. And what ends up happening is you end up bolting on security, and no one wants to be in that place, because once things start moving that rapidly, if you start bolting security on, there's just too many misses. It's too disruptive to what's already starting to take place within a development lifecycle. And so get out earlier and get out in front of it. So our migration to Kate's was starting to get discussed, as early as 2 years ago. And then once I saw it starting to happen in a development environment, in a testing environment, it hit me that this was something that we needed to do. So as you can see off the slides, having that central location to track vulnerabilities was absolutely key to me. And where I really thought that StackRox was unique was the fact that compliance controls were given to us that allowed us to set granular policy to help maintain compliance proactively, which is great. So, and it prevented us from breaking changes before they hit our production environment. So, it was really from that compliance perspective, it was massive, and then the ease of reporting and demonstrating for auditors how and which controls were being met, the overall solid compliance considerations to help ensure baseline security measures were not only in place, but also didn't get compromised by thoughtless or careless engineering changes. And it's not to point the finger at our engineering friends because they have a job to do. They're moving at rapid speed, but sometimes, you just don't consider these things when you're moving forward. And it's always easy to fat finger something. Since the beginning of my history in IT and security, we all fat finger things. I'm guilty as well too. So I'm not just pointing at the finger at engineering, but having, those considerations. And like I mentioned before, the baseline security measures in place is critical. And the other piece too is real around container image vulnerability identification. So it was an easy way for us to be able to find known vulnerabilities in our images and pinpoint exactly which line in our Docker file is creating the issue, and then letting us remediate it quickly. So easy to use APIs really helped us pinpoint these issues in our CI/CD tooling, and then avoid these issues from hitting prod. So lots of different reasons for us to start looking into solutions, but again, we found some uniqueness and synergy in StackRox. Another big thing too is the fact that they deploy in Kubernetes, which caught my attention right away, because you should drink your own champagne. So anytime that you start adopting new technology, the best way to get to know it is by using it yourself. And so, for them to be able to manage it, secure it within the native stack was massive for us. Michelle, do you mind changing slide, please, to the next one? So, this gives you a preview of what it looks like for us, so this kind of visibility to me and to my peers is invaluable, so we're a very highly regulated shop at Sumo Logic, so ISO 27001, CSA star, SOC 2 type 2, HIPAA audited every year, PCI, our entire environment's a CDE, going down the FedRAMP path, which again, this was critical to us as well, which I'll explain here in a second. EU Privacy Shield, CCPA, GDPR, take your abbreviation acronym flavor of the month and it falls under Sumo. At any given time, we're going through, 2 to 5 audits. And so from a executive level for me, having this kind of visibility into the different compliance postures that tie uniquely into a big part of our business, a big part of our strategy, the trust that we've built with our customers was just incredible, So I'm not necessarily going to get into the details daily like some of the folks on our team are, but I need to have these quick views in. And so just looking at our native environment, you can see now some nicely built out dashboards that just show some of the policies that have been in place, the controls that we're trying to adhere to within that stack, how they're working out, overall into the compliance type environment, then visibility also into the network topology. And so I think that that's a good place always to start as well. So I challenge a lot of times, my peers out there to say, what are you first doing within visibility? So gaining that visibility into your environment, how are you able to do that? And especially when it comes to things like containers and the CI/CD pipeline. And then beyond that visibility, now that you have it, what is it that you're doing to be able to establish those controls, that baseline for security, and then really start, providing those guardrails to that development community, which is absolutely key. We find that 9 times out of 10, especially at progressive development shops like Sumo, developers are going to lean in a little bit to open source, which is cool. I'm down with open source a lot of times, but having all this functionality in one location from the very beginning that takes you beyond visibility, more into policy setting, more into establishing controls, and then overall compliance reporting, which ties uniquely into the business and the strategic initiatives of a company is key. And so these, again, just giving you a quick visual of part of our environment and what that looks like is absolutely massive. And so, beyond, the way that we actually use the different tool sets, the fact that we're leveraging Kubernetes, it's critical for us as a company to not only take, what StackRox is doing, but then also initiate a partnership and then start building out applications ourselves via what StackRox brings in, so we can then cross-correlate that to the rest of our Sumo environment, to the rest of a lot of the SIM type information that we're bringing in, to be able to cross-correlate, parse and normalize that data, and then see what's happening across the entire environment. Because if I have something that's out of compliance or something that breaks a security violation or an alert within StackRox, I also want to be able to get that holistic picture. So with that, I'll go ahead and hand it off to Frank, who's very much go ahead, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, George, we've actually had a couple questions come in, and I just wanted to take a minute to dig into a little bit of a couple things you talked about. First off, I just love your point about visibility. I think it's super interesting. Not all CISOs are as tied into the tech stack broadly as you clearly are. And one of the things I've heard them struggle with is, this stuff's like sprouting up in a corner and I just don't know anything about it. People have been giving voice to the idea of, we're moving from shadow IT to shadow Kubernetes, right? Like the stuff's just sprouting around and I can't get a handle on it. So, and you also hinted at like this kind of natural tension that's existed for a long time between development and security, right? They're in some ways they're a little bit naturally at odds. So I'm really curious, when you talked about, I have to remind my peers sometimes that they've got to think about security early in the process. Can you share something that that you did early on to try to bridge this gap, to try to bring security and DevOps together and get security thinking more embedded into DevOps teams and DevOps processes?
Yeah, and that's a good point, Michelle. And thanks for going in there, because sometimes we end up going like a freight train when we start talking. The big thing is just extreme collaboration. So I have a very unique reporting style. So I report into our CEO, which is pretty common for a CISO, but then I also have a dotted line to our CRO. Our CDO. And that dotted line, what it allows for me to do is listen in on engineering calls, especially the leadership calls, get an idea of initiatives that are starting to come out. And we simply took a approach, because I'm also lucky enough to have 2 engineers on my team, software developers, security minded, but they're software developers, either way. And so I was lucky enough to be able to see what was coming, but then just say, look, low friction, this is what we're planning on adopting. So we are going to use StackRox. I mean, that's our tool of choice. We need to have something in place. We think that it's going to provide you a lot of value early on when you're, going through the testing phases and architecting and building this out. No pressure. We're here to support you. Our StackRox team is here to support you as well too. We think that this is the unique value that it brings. Like I said before, so one-stop shop to be able to, to meet all of your security controls as well as your overall solid compliance considerations to get that security baseline in place. And they naturally started migrating to it, which was big because we partner very tightly with the SRE team, Michelle, and you're right. Sometimes there can be friction because they want to move fast. But if you look at especially SREs, they're responsible for 1/3 of the CIA triad, which is availability. And so availability naturally ties into security. So a lot of SREs are like-minded when it comes to security. They just sort of need that nudge every once in a while, or to have something provided for them. Because I think, again, if I look at my peers, unfortunately, a lot of times they're just like, oh my gosh, we got to react to this now because this thing is starting to move out. And we were running bug bounties and all kinds of different things, within our environment that started uncovering things very early in the journey as to some of the vulnerabilities within Kate's. And so, providing that low friction, consultative approach back to engineering, especially the SRE saying, listen, we're not forcing anything on you, but this brings a ton of value. It really helped out quite a bit. And then eventually they started adopting it. And I'll pause here in a second because there's another really cool thing that's happening too that just started over the course of the last 2 weeks. So we acquired a company called Jask in November of 2019. And so because we already had StackRox in place and they're now putting all of the integration work back into our overall Sumo platform in Kate's, they picked up on it right away. I mean, they were just like, wow, so you guys already have something in place that will give us that kind of visibility, give us that kind of control, give us those kinds of policies and help us through this policy to where we don't have to really think about what's taking place. It'll be naturally baked into our Kate's push was extremely valuable. So they're now connected back into StackRox as well too. A lot of that work, like I said, started over the course of the last couple of weeks, but super exciting that we had something available there and they just naturally adopted it.
That's great. And I think your emphasis around like, how do you tie into the way they're already working and the way that they're already moving systems, moving software through their own systems, and that the security has to fit that mold. I think that makes it, it just makes a lot more sense because, when you and I have talked offline at different times, you're like, we can no longer be the land of no, right? Like that's not our job anymore. And, and so how do we, how do we say yes and how do we help them move forward? So we've had one other particular question and we'll move into to Frank's part, but somebody asked, question for George, the main 1 or 2 reasons that you chose StackRox over competitors. The compliance piece looks pretty thorough. I imagine that was one of the factors, but can you speak to anything else, that or anything else that helped you in your evaluation?
Yeah, I mean, like I said before, and I know I talked a lot and sometimes I talk fast because Spanish is my first language, but the fact that StackRox natively deployed into Kubernetes, I think that was a big vantage point So we are, a full-blown cloud company. I mean, we're 100% multi-tenant in AWS, and speed is everything to us, as well as adopting the latest and greatest technology. And so when we looked at, the Kubernetes deployment, we were like, yeah, we need someone who's like-minded to us, and that really mattered, So I think, just the way, the ease of use of deploying the actual tool set itself, which I talked about FedRAMP earlier, but this is a big piece too. When you're starting to do federal implementations, and think about, for those of you who are familiar, NIST 800-53 Rep 4, that's 325 controls that hit your environment. So very, very highly secure. And the federal government scrutinizes that environment thoroughly as to what fits into your boundaries. And the fact that StackRox deployed into Kubernetes, they didn't even blink. Like we were waiting for some pushback on the tool sets that we used, but the Joint Advisory Board, federal government, didn't even blink at the fact that we were using that tool set within our environment. So that was a key plus. And then the next one just kind of goes into what I was talking about before: one centralized location that has ease of reporting for auditors, where we can easily demonstrate how our controls are being met, and then the overall solid compliance considerations, and then that security baseline.
Awesome. That's a great overview. All right. So Frank, I think George was sort of teeing it up to you to talk about, like, how do we get this rich information in front of, SOC teams and other folks who are trying to sort through all this information.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks, George, for setting that all up. You're a tough act to follow, my friend. So just to kind of give a little bit of context about Sumo, I want to echo on some of the things that George was talking about. So yeah, we're using Sumo. We're using StackRox within Sumo. One of the things that's always been really important at Sumo is dogfooding. Dogfooding our own platform. We take our own telemetry from our deployments that are running across multiple AWS regions, and we pump that back into existing Sumo accounts. And we use our system to get insights into the behavior of the system, not only from an operational perspective, but also from a security perspective, of course. And so one of the things that's important that we also do with our StackRox integration is we also use the content that we develop jointly with StackRox. We launched a new solution for Kubernetes back in September. StackRox is one of our launch partners. StackRox, being Kubernetes native, having those deep insights natively into Kubernetes, they were a great launch partner with us. And they actually helped build what we call applications, which takes that insight and some of those insights that StackRox produces and brings them into a Sumo Logic. So for us, as Sumo on Sumo, our customer zero, our engineering teams, they get all these great insights kind of side by side with their operational, with their security data. So it is a really great integration that's important for us, and then kind of moving forward with that. Michelle, can you go to the next slide for me? So what I want to do is I want to kind of go a little deeper into some of the things that George was talking about. I'm going to talk about our journey to Kubernetes and our journey to StackRox as well, and kind of what led us there, and kind of why it's so critical to really think about this stuff really up front, like George was talking about. So our architecture, Sumo, we date back to 2010. We had a clean slate architecture, and we were founded in 2010. And, as George talked about, all of our different security attestations, security was in our blood. It was there from the beginning, dealing with log data. Some of our founders came from other companies where they knew the importance of security, and they knew the importance of bringing that into the cloud mindset. So it's always been in our blood and in our architecture from the beginning. Like George says, we're SaaS, we're multi-tenant, we're cloud native, we're microservices across AWS. On the right-hand side is just a very small fraction of some of the microservices that actually power Sumo, just really one point, and that's really just the ingestion point, of getting data in, not anything else, not the downstream services that use that data. Now, one of the things that is important to note is that we started in 2010, and today the open source has come so far in the last many years, and there's so much tooling that exists today that makes your life so much easier when you're working in cloud native architectures. It just simply didn't exist. We really had to make that tooling to go fast and to get that velocity that we needed. And we spent a good deal amount of time in non-trivial investments in all of this tooling. And again, this is pre-Kubernetes. Let's keep that in mind. This is before Kubernetes and before a lot of the great open source tooling that exists. We wanted to move to Kubernetes because we wanted to move faster. And we also saw the change in the open source tooling, how much it had grown up, how much it had improved, how much it had come up to par with a lot of the things that we had built already because we needed to have it. And we also wanted to start phasing out some of that really non-differentiated tooling that we had developed internally. And I'm going to echo this again because I think it's important, is that we have had a strong security posture from the beginning. We have a lot of processes in place to keep our systems secure and to keep our customers' data safe. And these processes were well defined. They were well known for our current architecture. And we were now going to be moving to Kubernetes. It changes things. It changes the way you have to think about things and the way you have to secure things. You can go to the next slide, Michelle. So we had to completely rethink our security posture. We had to really rethink these things. A lot of the same things still applied. There are applications. There's a lot of security components and processes that just worked and remain the same. But there's a lot that had to change because it's a completely new architecture. You're changing what you're running. You've got a lot more moving parts. You've got a lot more pieces to the puzzle that you have to make sense of and kind of keep together. And so we really, from the beginning, knew we had to take that security posture from the beginning, and that was really important for us. And we were learning Kubernetes as we were going. It was new to us, and this is why a vendor like StackRox was really an ideal fit, because they know Kubernetes so well because it's built on top of Kubernetes. The depth that they have within the security realm of Kubernetes is fantastic. It was the logical choice for us because it let us focus on architecture changes. It let us focus on things that we needed to do to move faster. We didn't have to reinvent the wheel across the board. We relied on a trusted vendor to help us kind of figure some of this stuff out and help us learn along the way. Another piece that was important to us is, we're in AWS. We've been in AWS a long time. And, again, we built a lot of tooling before a lot of managed services exist. There was no managed Kafka service. There was no a lot of different services that we needed to make our platform work. We had to take open source and kind of put our own flavor to it and build this to make it easier, to make our architecture work the way we needed it to. And as we're looking at Kubernetes, initially, we're looking at, rolling our own, doing a non-managed Kubernetes cluster. We're responsible for the master components. And for those of you who have never managed or had to manage the master components, it's a non-trivial activity. You have multiple components that all have to work together seamlessly to orchestrate your containerized environment between API server, controller manager, scheduler, etcd. All of these are big, important pieces of your Kubernetes cluster. If a single one of them goes down, it is likely your Kubernetes cluster will be foobarred, and you will not be a good place that you want to be in. So, and again, I'm going to reemphasize, we were brand new to Kubernetes. It was something new to us. We were trying to figure it out. So we look at these things. We look at, man, we don't need to take on all this security overhead that we need to. We need a partner, a trusted partner. We found that trusted partner in StackRox. We don't really need enough of another thing that we have to manage. We don't need more moving parts that we have to manage. And so one of the big things that we did that really helped us was to look at Amazon EKS, because this takes away a lot of the headache, a lot of the pain for us of managing that additional layer of the master components. Not only the operational side, but let's not forget about the security side of that, because now I have to secure those things. I have to keep those things secure. I have to watch those things, and I have to build processes around those things. Well, it really did introduce, a ton of different issues at this point. So that's kind of Sumo's journey. We're still in our journey to Kubernetes. We're learning new things every day. But I will echo one of the things that George said. Security is crucial, and it's not something you can just wait to do, especially when you're making a significant change, like moving to a Kubernetes architecture, because there's a whole lot of new components. There's a bigger surface area that attacks can happen on, and it's just really important to keep that really in the forefront of your mind.
That is a fantastic overview, Frank, and you make some really interesting points. You guys were crazy early in all of this. You went really, really far when there were not a lot of, industry tools available. And I'm curious, it probably goes both ways. You probably have some things, and you talked about this, like, oh, we don't have to worry about this anymore because now we can get a service for that. You talked about a managed Kafka service, for example. Yeah. So are there, I don't know, how can people think about what are the things that are reasonable to look to either third-party suppliers or managed services for? And then if you are comfortable with this, just quickly commenting on what are some of the things that you have decided to kind of keep more close to the vest, or more, you know, there is value add in having the Sumo way of doing something. I'm just curious if there's a couple of buckets you could describe for where it's cool to go outside and an area where you've kept it more inside.
Yeah, of course. You know, like all things, it takes research and what matters to you. Everyone is going to have some important piece to their architecture or a component that they've developed internally that does something specific, and that maybe there is an off-the-shelf solution for, but maybe there's one piece that is crucial to your needs, and it doesn't do that. And that's, you have to really take the time to evaluate that on a need-by-need basis. But I encourage you to do so. There's a lot of value in this, because building everything yourself can slow you down. It gives you a lot of control. It gives you a lot of control over things. It can reduce some risk, of course, but it can also slow you down when you have more and more things to maintain. You worry more about the pieces of your infrastructure that you have to keep up than relying on a service. And, you know, I'll say it, relying on AWS just to make sure that it's running for you, right? There's some benefits there. As far as within Sumo, you know, I talked about the managed Kafka service. There was an example, but let me give one that kind of really bridges the operational and the security gap for us at Sumo. In Sumo, we developed an internal tool called Dish. And the purpose of Dish was a lot of our provisioning and how we do provisioning of cloud infrastructure, and a lot of like security related components, how we connect to things, how we control access to things as well. And Dish was entirely homegrown. Now, when I say cloud provisioning, a lot of you people are probably thinking, well, why wouldn't you use Terraform? You're absolutely right. We should use Terraform. Terraform didn't exist in 2010. And we had to have something to do this. Now, Terraform has come a long way. It is integrated within the cloud providers. The AWS provider really lets us do all the same provisioning that we would do. Dish was declarative, just like this was. So there's a lot of overlap now. And so one of the things we're doing is we're looking at replacing components of Dish that are no longer differentiated, because open source has caught up. Open source tooling exists, and there's a lot of overlap with us. But there are some components that we built in Dish that we still depend on, that are still crucial to us. Primarily a lot of the security related things, to how we connect to that infrastructure, how we see the security of that infrastructure, that we'll still need and we'll keep around. And so are we doing a full rip and replace? No, but we are gonna augment and looking into augmenting some of that so that we can save ourselves the hassle of having to maintain the world. We can rely on only maintaining the things that are crucial to us and what we believe is differentiated for Sumo.
That is an awesome example, and we hear that a lot. And I think you're making a great point, which is that when you decide to take something on, it's not a one-time thing, because now you have to continue to maintain that thing you decided to build. And so that cost is ongoing. And your point about, you know, just take an ongoing look at that, evaluate it as you go, and see what you can move, because it's no longer differentiated. I think that's excellent advice, and well put. All right, cool. I think we will change gears. Thank you so much, Sumo team, and you are here as more questions come in. I'm keeping my eye, and audience, please do send over questions. Again, it makes it a lot more fun. Oh, we forgot this one. Sorry, Frank.
I did. No, you're good. I just realized this. So I talked a lot about dog fooding. I talked a lot about our solution. I wanted to share a little bit of how do we get this data? How do we do that? We have developed a collection process that we dog food internally as our migration to get this data. And we're capturing everything from the Kubernetes clusters, whether it's logs, events, and metrics, but more importantly, the security events. And you know, this integration was developed in joint with StackRox. It's a great integration that we love dog fooding side by side, because it really helps us give ourselves the operational and security visibility we need together in a single place. So it's been very, very valuable. And thanks to the team who developed that with us at StackRox, it's been really important to the team here at Sumo. Not only the unification of this across your solution with our solution paired together has really given Sumo what we need to move forward with our move to Kubernetes from a security perspective.
Cool. And you're sharing here kind of your perspective as a practitioner, but just so the audience understands, we're super lucky because Sumo is both a customer and a partner. And so the goodness that Sumo customers get in terms of seeing all these aggregated results and getting all this intelligence out of the Sumo platform, we did the work together to enrich that and bring the security insights that come, in our case, come primarily through our deep integrations with Kube. Now, Sumo customers get to see that right in the Sumo pane of glass. So
exactly right.
Indeed, that's been a very cool project. All right, with that, Jonah, let's come over to you and have you take us through a little bit about what's going on the EKS side and making, I think, a great point around the shared responsibility model. So go ahead and take it away.
Sure. So Frank brought up a really good point just a minute ago, which is talking about running managed Kubernetes versus running your own Kubernetes, and that's really hard. And so I'm here to talk a little bit about some of the benefits of running Amazon EKS, which is the managed control plane for Kubernetes, and tying it back into the security point of this talk, which is kind of the way that we view security with Amazon EKS. And we call it the shared responsibility model. So first, just talking a little bit about Kubernetes, and I think we probably have a pretty good base. We like to say that 51% of workloads run on AWS today. And with that, Amazon EKS is quickly becoming one of our fastest growing services on AWS. And I think that is large part because of the strong open source community and the strong development community that comes with Kubernetes. However, like with strong development comes strong responsibility, which is also typically tied to security, right? And so here's a screenshot of all of our customers that are adopting Kubernetes on Amazon. And we're going to talk a little bit about the shared responsibility model. So I want to first go over a little bit of the architecture of what EKS looks like, so that when we talk about it, it makes a little bit more sense here. And all of these are coming one at a time, which is great. So we have our control plane, which is part of the managed offering. And like he mentioned, that's the scheduler, the controllers, the API server, etcd, and it's all load balanced across multi-AZ to be a single tenant solution that's highly available. And then the data plane is where people will run their applications on Kubernetes. And so that's part of the customer's responsibility. And so with the control plane, we have all these compliance certificates. And I think George brought up a great point that compliance is really difficult, and knowing that you have compliance out of the box can be hugely beneficial, because that's one less thing that you have to worry about. So we have ISO, PCI, SOC. We are missing FedRAMP, but that's currently being investigated. But for a service that's less than 2 years old, we have done a lot of work in this space, and security is always going to be our #1 focus for Amazon EKS. So tying that back into what does that mean for you? Well, this is a great example, because if anyone remembers, last year in February, there was a run C vulnerability for upstream Kubernetes on the latest release. And this was a big issue, and it got patched right away. But for Amazon EKS, we strategically keep the control plane slightly behind the current version, because security is and always is our #1 focus. So we can catch things like this ahead of time, and we can post them to our open source security bulletin. And we actually wrote a community blog post going in depth as to how this happens and how you can solve it, because we think it's important that we can give back to the community so that we can kind of keep security level across the whole playing field. So what does that mean for you? So obviously Amazon EKS is putting a lot of work into managing our control plane. And as a customer, I think you have a lot of responsibility managing your applications and the things that differentiate you as a business. And so that is going to come with data plane security and container lifecycle security. And when we're talking about those aren't two trivial things. Those cover a lot of areas. So that can be starting down at the host OS layer. We're talking about Linux kernel, network access policies in Kubernetes, RBAC and pod security policies, all the way up to your customer data and your customer applications and all the different compliance certificates you need running on those and securing that. So while Amazon EKS provides you all of the control plane security, when it comes to securing the data plane and container lifecycle, we often will look to a partner, especially one like StackRox, who specializes in Kubernetes workloads and securing them, and kind of fill in the missing gaps to build that complete secure puzzle, right? And adopting it early, because launching Amazon EKS can be, you can easily launch a cluster in 15 minutes. So kind of getting security and baseline level is a lot easier than trying to kind of strap it on later, right? Because once you have workloads running, it gets a little bit more difficult. So I know we kind of went over a little bit here about our shared security model, but I think it's a great segue because we're talking about the benefits the managed service can provide for securing your control plane. And we think that managing the data planes is actually the more difficult part. And so bringing in practitioners like StackRox can be your benefit. And so hopefully they can cover a little bit more about how they can provide that security here.
Yeah, absolutely. And we will go there next. But before we do that, this is really helpful. And I think seeing it laid out like this in particular, Jonah, is kind of eye-opening. I have to say that one of the most common questions we get when we're at like a trade show or something like that, remember when we used to have those? One of the most common questions we get is, well, I'm going to do this in the cloud, so I'm all good, right? Because basically it's the cloud's problem then. And it's, this puts it really in stark relief just how much the customer is still responsible for. And, we'll get asked, right, well, how do you keep mattering if people keep adopting the cloud? And it's like, well, where does security of your app live? And they go, well, that's me. It's like, right, so that's always going to be you. Like, no matter how good the services get, there's some level where it's your workload, your app, and that's the part that that people, I think, sometimes get confused about.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So when you lay this out for folks, what do you think are a couple of the more important steps that customers need to take themselves to really address this bit? Like where can they start when they look at all that stuff in orange? What do you recommend is one or two of the places to maybe first think about making sure they've adequately put in some protections?
Yeah, definitely. So one thing that's not quite shown on this slide, but I think is an important thing, is that when you get an Amazon EKS cluster, you get an API endpoint for that. And you have the option to get a public one or a private endpoint. And so that's a great place to kind of start your journey of thinking about security, if you want this to be a private or public cluster. And just because, and if it is a public endpoint, I think the first and most important thing is making sure that you have tight security rules in place for that communication with that endpoint and hosts. And I think so that would be probably the first place you would start.
Okay.
Just kind of what that black
helpful.
line is. Yeah, the little transit between the two colors there.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, I do want to leave some time. I'm going to go into a couple of questions popped up actually that I think our content's going to get into. So I'm going to step into this a little bit and then invite more questions as we go. And we are doing well on time, guys. So please, in the audience, do send in your questions. So I just want to talk a little bit about some of the themes that George and Frank raised in particular, right? Some of the key challenges that, right, we're all on this learning curve, and it's really both sides. DevOps is learning like what security is relevant in this world. Okay, there's by default really no security is enabled, so what am I going to turn on first? And then security, of course, has some responsibility to understand what's coming down the pike. I really loved when George was saying, I have a dotted line responsibility to the CDO, which I believe is their chief development officer, and so he has insights into the projects that are coming. But it's really there's going to be some responsibility on the part of security teams to understand a little bit about the infrastructure. They're not going to become Kube experts, right? Let's be realistic. But they have to understand enough that they can be relevant in this world. The whole notion of shifting left, I realize it's become buzzword bingo here, but George said, One of the biggest mistakes my peers make is they don't start early enough with security. And then just the sheer pace of everything, right? If you are trying to do things in any kind of waterfall way, you're just perpetually behind. There's no way. So to keep up, you've really got to do security differently. And so here on the right side then are some of the things that we think are really important to get it right in securing containers and Kube. The shared responsibility bit, and here we don't so much mean the cloud side as the fact that DevOps needs to bridge over to security really tightly. Secondly, there's so much to learn. That learning curve is really steep. So leverage what you can that the industry has already created. Leverage, stand on the shoulder of giants and use the information. Don't reinvent the wheel. So when Sumo was talking about, why would we continue to build our own service if there's something available that works and it's no longer a differentiated opportunity for us? In a lot of ways, the same goes for these policies. Leverage something that's already there, that already has the know-how of, how frequently should something be scanned? What is best practice for setting, root access on containers? Pull something that's already got it so you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Getting that instant feedback and getting it in the existing panes of glass, getting it in the systems people are already using. So Sumo talked about that for the downstream events, right? So getting security alerts in your Sumo system is fantastic for the SOC team because it's already the world they occupy. Don't make them go somewhere else. But the same goes for getting developer feedback, right? If a build's not compliant, let's get that feedback really quickly. Let's get it at the moment they're trying to submit that build, and let's get it in Jenkins or Circle CI or whatever system they're already in with the information of why this isn't working, what they need to do to fix it so that they can build securely. And then, of course, none of this is going to work if we aren't making security follow DevOps practices, right? It's got to be automated. It's got to be scalable. And when George talked about, part of the attraction that Sumo had on the StackRox side was the fact that StackRox deploys in Kube. That's a big part of it. We're using native Kube controls. You don't want some invisible hand acting off to the side because then nobody knows what's going on, right? Kube says one thing, the world looks like something else. How do you reconcile that? So quick snapshot, I won't go into depth here because this is, you can get this information elsewhere, but very briefly, StackRox Kubernetes security platform spans build, deploy, and run. We think it's super important that you get this feedback throughout this process, and it is a continuous process. Our policy engine has a whole bunch of those industry best practices, CIS benchmarks, all these controls built in. And quickly, there's a customer question here. How many security policies will a typical deployment have configured for Kubernetes? Our system has hundreds of checks. They are all on just for alert at first. What we tend to see is the customers go in chunks. They tend to move through some of these use cases that you see here. So very often vulnerability management will be a starting point. And so they'll enable the handful of policies that really apply to vulnerability management, spanning both containers and Kube. And then they'll move on and turn on the compliance checks like George was talking about. Which ones are important to your industry? You'll know for your business and you can enforce on those. And then I'd say risk profiling comes in next where people say, the combination of, okay, it's got this kind of vulnerability and it's running in prod and it's open to the internet and it's a customer facing app. That sort of constellation is really important to us and we're going to enforce on that. So I'd say there isn't really an answer, Michael, about how many security policies will apply. I think it grows over time, and the more you can repurpose what's already been created, the faster your journey will be. Of course, everything needs to be API driven. Sumo was talking about the fact that this has to feed into all of their systems. Anything that happens in the StackRox UI got there from an API call, and the world's just got to work that way because it's got to tie into all your developer systems, et cetera. And then, the need to work in any Kubernetes environment and run anywhere that you're running. I think that that's super important. And, we're super excited to have this partnership with AWS. A ton of our customers are running Kube on AWS. We run a survey about every 6 or 8 months about what our customers are doing. The most recent round, we got information from almost 600 respondents. And EKS was the most popular form of Kubernetes that our user base was running. And it just edged out self-managed Kube for the first time. So pretty interesting. And we're really proud of having attained containers competency with AWS. We are available on the marketplace, and we support private offers. And the beauty of that for you guys on the customer side is that means ability to support using third-party tooling like StackRox within your AWS contract. So it just makes everything really easy for you. No new kind of procurement, et cetera. Okay, question went away. And so we want to hear from you. We're going to keep the platform open for a couple minutes. I'm just going to leave off with a couple of next steps. It really is amazing how when you solve the security problem, your dev teams can run so much faster. People assume that if you start to apply security that you're inherently going to slow things down. But if you do it in a way that gets that feedback really early in the cycle and puts the feedback in the pane of glass your developers are already in, it doesn't slow things down. It builds the confidence. And what we've seen is that customers accelerate their application development because they know the security part is just built in. It's just coming along on the ride for free, and they're going to be protected. We have a lot of information that we've done on taking those next steps. You know, Jonah laid out all that stuff in orange. That's the customer responsibility. We've laid out, how do you do that stuff in orange? What are those security best practices for deploying on EKS? So we have a tremendous amount of information available in our blog, in some white papers, things like that. So check those out. We would love to invite anybody who wants to take a sort of a personal spin on StackRox, understand how we could make that work for you. And we are really excited to offer AWS customers a few particular offers. So we're going to be able to offer you an extended trial. So rather than the typical 10-day, we're offering a 30-day trial for folks who follow up with this webinar. And we're also going to work together with AWS to give you an engineering-led guided POC so that you can really see for your deployment, you know, things like Michael's question around security policies, for example, see what that's like in your environment. And so we welcome you to take us up on these offers. I want to come back over here to the question side. We have had another one come in. Jonah, it'll be curious what, you know, maybe you have this off the top of your head. I don't know if it's too big of a range. How long does it take to cut over to Amazon EKS for a typical project?
Yeah, so I think a lot of that depends on the scope of the project, for sure. I think there are a few technical limitations such as version. So if you are at the absolute latest version of Amazon EKS is at 1.15 currently, so that would be a blocker. But otherwise than that, Amazon EKS is a 100% upstream open source compliant Kubernetes cluster. So there shouldn't be much overhead that comes with the cutover. And obviously I think those are the golden words. There shouldn't be, but sometimes there is. So I think if you have a small enough project, I could see it being weeks, if not a month or two. And for larger projects, obviously more time and effort would be involved.
Okay, that's super helpful. And you know, this is really one of the more powerful aspects of Kubernetes. You know, people are sort of mystified sometimes when they step back and they say, holy cow, how did Kube see the kind of open adoption, quick adoption, volume adoption it has as fast as it has? And I think a lot of the power is that whatever form of it you're using, it's still Kube. And you get tremendous benefits around scale and flexibility and portability. And, you know, we've really tried to echo that in the StackRox platform so that all of that magic of Kube and the fact that it can run anywhere and you can move environments, it moves with you. And we've done the same thing at the security layer, right? So that's the power that we derive by tying into Kube, is to make those security policies follow you anywhere, because we think that consistency is super important. And I think, you know, EKS is a great example of that. All right, I am not seeing additional questions come in. We are a few minutes before the top of the hour. I want to thank everybody, George and Frank and Jonah, on the speaking side. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences and your talents. People have so much to learn from you guys, and I'm really grateful for your time.
Thanks very much for having us.
Yeah,
okay.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun, and we'll follow up with folks on the call. Happy to entertain any questions that you might have after the fact. You can just reach out to us. And again, big hearty thanks to our speakers. Super great to partner with both Sumo Logic and AWS. And we welcome you in the user community to look at how you can follow in Sumo's footsteps and really leverage the power of what's out there to lessen the burden on yourself and gain all the advantages of Kubernetes with a lot less in-house work. So thank you so much, everybody, for tuning in. Have a great day. Stay safe, and we'll see you out there in the ether again.
Awesome. Thanks, Michelle.
Be safe. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.